French President Emmanuel Macron has acknowledged his country's role in the 1994 Rwanda Genocide and sought forgiveness at a remembrance event in Kigali. For his first public stop, he visited the Genocide Memorial, where he has said his country was complacent in the killings. The genocide has been a major sticking point between both countries. President Paul Kagame has repeatedly accused France of aiding in the atrocities. Macron's visit, which is the first by a French head of state since 2010, looks to reset relations between both countries. In a joint press conference, President Kagame said Macron's words were, quote, more valuable than an apology. Here is CGTN's Wilkister Nyabwa with more.
President Emmanuel Macron arrived in Rwanda on Thursday morning. Together with Rwanda's President Paul Kagame, he headed to the Genocide Memorial Site in the capital, Kigali, where 250,000 victims of the mass killings of 1994 are buried. 27 years after the Rwanda genocide, Macron acknowledged his country's responsibility in the genocide, but did not offer an outright apology.
27 years of bitterness have passed, 27 years of incomprehension, of a sincere attempt to get closure that was unsuccessful. There were 27 years of suffering for those whose intimate stories remain raw because of the pain of the memory. And so with modesty and respect, as I stand by your side today, I come to recognize our responsibility.
Over 800,000 ethnic Tutsis and moderate Hutus were killed by Hutu militias in 100 days of killings that began in April 1994. Macron's visit follows the release of a report by a French inquiry panel that said a colonial attitude had blinded French officials and the government bore a serious and overwhelming responsibility for not foreseeing the slaughter. However, the report absolved France of direct complicity in the killings, a point Macron also made in his speech.
The killers who stalked the swamps, the hills, and the churches were not French. France was not an accomplice. The blood that was shed has not dishonored the hands of its soldiers. They themselves saw the unforgettable as they tended to wounds and choked on their tears. But France has a role, a history, and a political responsibility in Rwanda.
Rwandan President Paul Kagame hailed Macron's speech.
His words were something more valuable than an apology. They were the truth. Speaking the truth is risky, but you do it because it is right.
Rwanda has released its own report that found that France was aware that the genocide was being prepared and bore responsibility for enabling it by continuing its unwavering support for Rwanda's then-president, Juvenal Habyarimana. It was the shooting down of Habyarimana's plane, killing the president, which set off the 100 days of killing. Macron's visit and acknowledgement is geared at helping to reset the relationship between the two countries. The French president is now set to name a new ambassador to Rwanda, the first accredited French envoy since 2015.
Fundamentally, this visit is about the future, not the past. France and Rwanda are going to relate much better to the benefit of both our peoples, economically, politically, and in terms of culture.
From Rwanda, Macron will travel to South Africa, where he will meet President Cyril Ramaphosa to discuss the COVID-19 pandemic and regional crisis, including one in Mozambique. Wilkister, Nyabwa, CGTN.
Right now, for more on this, we're joined by ISMAEL Buchanan, a professor of political science at the University of Rwanda. He joins us live now from Kigali. Professor, Macron gave a carefully worded speech, just stopping short of a formal apology, but also accepting France's responsibility for the genocide. How significant is that speech, would you say?
Thank you very much. I think the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, as you say, his words were very significant indeed, and at the same time, I found out as substantively strong. Why did I say that? First of all, he recognized his country's law in Rwanda genocide, at the same time by hoping for forgiveness. So by quoting him, I can say that, as he mentioned, that I have to come to recognize our responsibility. That is the first step. Number two, I think when I quote him, when he said that only those who went through that night, which means the genocide, can perhaps forgive, and in doing so, can give the gift of forgiveness. I think that's what we're very strong to show that how President Macron were ready to ask for forgiveness. And at the same time, when he mentioned something, I caught from him that I hereby humbly and with respect standing by your side today, and I come to recognize to some extent our responsibility. So for me, those words were very strong and powerful. He did it in a substantive manner, and at the same time, we can say that those words were lauded with gravity and dignity, at the same time with the truth in it. So to me, I would say that by saying that really President Macron did agree to come to Rwanda, and at the same time to visit the Kigali site memorial to apologize on his behalf, and at the same time on the French involvement during the Rwandan genocide against Tutsi in 1994.
And Professor, Macron's visit is significant in that it is the first by a French president since 2010. What do the two countries then stand to gain by resetting ties?
That is a good question. I think looking at the visit of President Macron and what he mentioned in his speech, I will start by saying that the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, has, number one, promised to arrest any genocide perpetrators found to be living in France. So that is the first step to appreciate that, you know, so many times, many years has passed, different people who involved in genocide in Rwanda were staying in France, walking freely. So you can see that now, as far as Macron has taken a step to make sure they can chase out everybody who involved in the genocide who are living in France. That is the first step. Number two, I think a range of issues were being included, mostly investment and support for businesses, which means that they want to really raise the issue of having investors from France, as far as the Rwandan people are also business people can also go invest in France. At the same time, to me, as you mentioned something to gain, I think by appointing the new French embassy to Rwanda after 6 years without French embassy here, it is another milestone, which means having an embassy was one thing, a French embassy, but having ambassador also. What does it mean in the long run? This means that the bilateral cooperation between Rwanda is going really to be a truce, and at the same time with a permanent stay of ambassador in Rwanda, which can really open up the bilateral cooperation with Rwanda. At the same time, let me reiterate that the French embassy, I mean the French government used to have what we call it Quatre Centro, which teach French language. So you understand it's going to be boost to have once again the boosting of a French language in Rwanda, even though we still speak French, but of course after having quarrel with the problem with the French. So this was really a big problem, a big challenge. Of course, you know that we are using French and English, but by boosting French languages, of course, going to have a big title with that. So with this kind of bilateral cooperation, I would say that France is going to gain something in terms of business, in terms of investment, and also in terms of bilateral cooperation, both Rwanda and French.
Professor, thank you very much for speaking to us on Africa Live. That's ISMAEL Buchanan, Professor of Political Science at the University of Rwanda, joining us live from Kigali.